what I said to myself is, okay, it may not be Moby Dick, but you need to try to write this story down. And if you fail, okay, but you got to try. I gave myself permission to fail, but I made sure that I gave it my best.
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, conversations with interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is Helen Morse, Kirkland class of 1976. All right. Right off the bat, I want to share some news about a former guest. Congratulations to Monk Rowe. Monk, as you know, is the director of the Phileas Jazz Archive. And just a few weeks ago, he's essentially launched the podcast version of the archive. He's taking some of the best highlights from the hours and hours and hours of interviews with jazz musicians and put them into a podcast. The podcast is called Jazz Backstory and can be found wherever you get your podcasts. We'll have a link to it in the show notes, and definitely check that out. Not only does it feature excerpts from the interviews from the archive, but also has commentary from Monk and original music. If you're a jazz fan, it's a must-listen. If you're not a jazz fan, it's a must-listen to get yourself educated on an incredible art form. Again, Jazz Backstory, link in the show notes. Get it wherever you get your podcasts. Congratulations, Monk. And definitely go back and check out my conversation with Monk. I talked to Monk back in January of 2021, episode 31, if you're searching for it down the list there. It was a fun one. Great insight into the archive and a good primer for Jazz Backstory. All right, this week I talked to Helen Morse from the Kirkland class of 1976. Helen is a photographer whose art has been displayed all over the globe. And while we talk quite a bit about her art, what drew me to having this conversation was that Helen recently published a memoir. That book, The Difficult Girl, is getting rave reviews on Amazon, and as Helen says, is selling incredibly well. It is an often sad yet beautiful retelling of Helen's growing up with her father, who was the editor-in-chief of Funk and Wagnall's Encyclopedia, her mother, who was a burlesque dancer. She talks about growing up in Palm Beach, living in the house that once belonged to Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And through the memoir, there are a truly unique cast of characters. There's utter heartbreak throughout the story. And I was truly fascinated to understand how Helen came to share these stories publicly. A common theme in the conversations on this show are about how appearances don't always tell the truth. Everybody's got problems they're dealing with. This book is an extreme example of that. Now, this is a pretty wide-ranging conversation exploring all facets of Helen's life and art. So if this conversation doesn't go deep enough into the book, well, tough. It's my show. I'll make it how I want. No. If this doesn't go enough into the book, you're in luck, because Helen will be taking part in a virtual author talk being put on by Hamilton Tuesday, September 27th at 7:15 Eastern. You can register for that event at hamilton.edu/alumni/events. Again, hamilton.edu/alumni/events. We'll have a link in the show notes to go directly there to register for that event where you can hear Helen talk more about the book. So use this conversation as an appetizer to that talk where Helen will talk more about The Difficult Girl. This conversation is a great look into a life in art. the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I hope you enjoy it. Here is Helen Morse, Kirkland class of 1976. It's a podcast about talking to interesting members of the school's community, and well, you certainly fit the bill.
That's cool. I hope I'm interesting. Yeah.
I don't doubt it. Well, I guess I'll start with, and I know you have a slightly different answer to this question, but how did you end up at Kirkland?
Oh, well, I had started out actually wanting to go to Kirkland, and I didn't get in. But I got into Sarah Lawrence instead. And so I tootled off to Sarah Lawrence, kind of mad that I hadn't gotten into Kirkland.
And what was it that drew you to Kirkland? What made you want to go there?
I think that it was the location of it. Sarah Lawrence and Kirkland weren't so different.
Sure.
At the time, because Sarah Lawrence was sort of an avant-garde kind of a different kind of college that didn't give you grades per se, but they kept them in the office. But grades were not the important thing to pursue. It was really about your education and your experience. And Kirkland was the same. I chose them both for that reason. Also, Sarah Lawrence was very interested in kids that were artsy, and I certainly was that. And but I had a friend that was going off to Kirkland, and we were going together, and then we weren't. So I spent 2 years at Sarah Lawrence, and I don't know how much you know about Sarah Lawrence, but it was a pretty intense experience. And I thought, well, I'm going to reapply to Kirkland just to sort of check it out. And so I did that. I had wanted to get into photography, couldn't manage to get into a class for it at Sarah Lawrence. And I thought, well, maybe at Kirkland. And lo and behold, I can remember going to the admissions interview and looking the admissions officer in the eye and saying, "You wouldn't do this to me again, would you?"
No.
And she laughed, and of course I got in. But I did end up doing photography at Kirkland. And I think, as I mentioned to you, I was very intensely involved in that for the last 2 years of my college career. And it was at Kirkland. And I found this wonderful teacher mentor there. And when the year was up for my little, transfer experimental year, and I was due back at Sarah Lawrence, I decided to stay at Kirkland because of him.
Interesting.
So,
and was the interest and passion in photography there prior to Kirkland, or did that come out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It had been there for some time. I had gotten involved in it in high school, actually.
Okay. And was Kirkland what you had hoped it would be when you finally got there?
It was. I mean, it was because of Steve Liebman, who was my photography professor. It was everything and more. It was a very meaningful experience for me. It became a lifelong passion. I mean, it was already there, but it cemented it for me.
Talk to me about that. You have that experience, you lock yourself in the dark room, and then you decide to go off and make it a lifelong passion. What's the plan? How do you is it a conscious decision? I'm going to go off and be a photographer now, or an artist?
Well, it's sort of a patchy plan, not really the most well-formed plan, because
they rarely are.
because actually, unless you want to be a wedding photographer,
right.
I was planning on being an artist. I mean, basically art photography, meaning I don't do photographs, or didn't do photographs in a commercial way. I did them and showed them in galleries. So it was a kind of an unusual thing. When I left Kirkland, I ended up at the Eastman House Museum on Steve's recommendation. He said, "Go west, young woman, and go to the town of Rochester, where they have the biggest museum for photography in the world." And I did. And he advised me actually to move to an apartment near the museum and go there every day
Huh.
and someone would eventually notice me and give me a job. And that's exactly what happened.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just walk. Just go
I
to the
went
point where you're there every day. You become part of the furniture, and they give you a
They
job.
said, "Do I know you? Oh, really? Oh, we have an opening. Come on upstairs."
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah, so he was right.
And is the idea of getting a job there is just being in and around the art
Oh,
form?
I met I met the people that I was studying in college. I mean,
Huh.
I met these people who are legendary in the world of photography. And they walked right into the office where I was working and sat down and chatted. I mean,
Uh-huh.
it was amazing. It was incredibly fulfilling.
Uh-huh.
It was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. You know, it was a nice segue from college into that job.
And then how in part of that process in meeting these idols and these people you've
Yeah,
studied,
yeah.
at what point do you say, all right, I'm ready to show my own work, and how does that happen?
Oh, it happens. It's almost accidentally. My first big break, I guess, was actually a photograph that I had put up in my senior thesis, and Tess Gallagher, who everyone knows now as a very famous poet in her own right. She was teaching at Kirkland,
Hmm.
and she approached me and she said, "I'm doing my first book, and I love this photograph. May I use it on my cover?"
Wow.
And I said, "Yeah, sure." There was no payment. I was so excited that anybody, was in love with a photograph of mine that
Right.
basically I fell in love with her and I said, yes.
Wow.
So I did the first cover for Tess Gallagher for a very long and venerable career on
Wow.
her part. And then years later, I actually approached her and said, "Would you review my book?" And of course she did me the same favor, and it was actually very nice. She said, "Oh, of course," because I wrote her a note and I said, I hope I don't know that you remember me." She was like, "Of course I remember you. You did that cover." So it was very a very nice thing.
Did
Yeah.
that sort of open your eyes to the viability of this as an endeavor?
It did, except that going and working at the Eastman House Museum actually was a very good lesson in all of the the ugly side of art photography, which is that people submit their work to the museum or a gallery or wherever they're submitting work, and they're lucky if the person they're sending to ever looks at what they've sent.
Hmm.
I reviewed more portfolios than the curator, my boss, did, but I didn't have the power to say yes or no on
Hmm.
whether we would acquire the work or if there was a show. But I would point stuff out to him. But it's the art world is a very jaded kind of ugly place in some ways,
Hmm.
and it was a real turnoff in that regard. When I left there, I'd had a really good reality check as to how everything worked. And the truth is that the curator at the time entertained the famous photographers and the ones that were fun to have a cocktail with. And where does that leave all of these other struggling photographers who are every bit as good
Yeah.
and talented and wonderful? It's a very closed, tight world. I mean, I'm sure this is true in every profession. There's
Right.
an ugly underbelly to it.
Right.
And that is what it is in the art world. If you're not a schmoozer and
Huh.
and someone that is prone to theater and loves theater, it's a little bit harder to get ahead or to be noticed. I mean, Salvador Dali dressed the way he did for a reason.
Hmm.
And it wasn't entirely because he just had to do that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, so
The branding element of it all, right?
yeah,
Building the personal
absolutely, in a
brand,
funny
and yeah.
way. I mean, there's just there's that thing, and
Huh. So would you see then in reviewing work when you were at the museum,
yeah,
presumably there was countless strong
yes,
pieces of work that would get pass by and
would never be seen by the curator and would be either tossed in the trash or mailed back if they sent a self-addressed envelope.
Yeah.
I mean, it just really sort of opened my eyes a little bit to how things work. And the truth is art galleries struggle. I mean, to have an art gallery is to have a financially losing kind of a gambit. And it's hard to make money at art. Everyone loves art. Everyone wants it there. But not as many people are willing to step up and open their wallet and buy some. And so, it's a great thing to go to a gallery and look around, but how many of us actually say, okay, I'll take that one.
Right.
And so, in a lifetime of showing work and having friends that show work, there's no question that unless you find and finding a niche sometimes is entirely someone's good luck. Other times it's that inexplicable thing. I mean, look at Thomas Kincaid. It's just treacle and mall art, but he laughed all the way to the bank for many years. So it's really and there would be other people who'd be offended by that comment because it is so subjective. For me, it's not great art, but for some people, it's something they love and they have it in their home and it gives them great joy. And there's really, no one that can really be, I mean, of course, there are probably art critics that could say, I can be the art arbiter, but it is a very subjective thing.
It is. Someone has to stand there and look at it and make their own decision on, do I like this? Do I understand it? Do I want to understand it? And to have, and to have someone screen that for you before you even walk in to get to know what you get to see is it makes it hard. Yeah.
Right. So there are an awful lot of really talented, wonderful artists out there that don't get a break. I mean, and there are others that are mediocre that do for whatever reason. I mean, I don't know, you're familiar with the Blue Dogs?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, this guy is painting blue dogs. Every painting is a blue dog. I mean, they're fun. I can't say they're not fun. They are fun.
Right.
But he's the one that's making bank. So, I don't know. It's a mysterious thing. It's been a very satisfying thing for me in my life. It's something that I've always loved. I love it anyway. I do it not because I think I'm going to make money, because I'm probably not more often than not. But it's something that is a very personal thing. And I think most people who keep at it their whole life long, that is what it is, including the guy that does the blue dogs. There's something about that blue dog that means something to him.
Right. Well, that's one of the things I'm very interested in. I'm interested when I talk to writers, and we're going to get into that part of you in a bit. But in terms of your photography and your art, you're making it because you just said it's deeply personal.
Yes.
But the business side of it makes it so someone else needs to like it, and that there must be at some point a struggle of, do I need to go do the blue dog because that's what people want to go buy? Or I had one gallery owner that told me, we really like your work, but we want you to make it bigger, like 6 or 7 times bigger, and can you make it sepia tone? Or I can't remember whether he said blue or sepia tone. Yeah. But it was like, well, then that's not my work anymore. I mean, you're going for a look for your gallery. Right. And that really is the case that I mean, gallerists, and they're entitled to what they want to show and what they want to hang. Yeah. So there's always this kind of, conflict going on, and it just depends on how interested you are in sacrificing what you find important to say with what a gallerist wants, so that they'll show your work. And that's not to say I've shown my work a lot over the years. I'm not a famous artist by any means, but I've kept at it, and of course I've had shows. I've got one I'm going to in October, actually. Okay. In Barcelona. Nice.
an international competition, which I'm included in, and it's going to be a blast to
That's
go
fantastic.
to another country and see my work up.
Yeah.
But it's not the kind of business that you should go into if you want to make a lot of money.
Right.
It just isn't.
Right.
Yeah.
And why photography for you? What is it about that art form?
I fell in love with it when I was a child. I mean, my first camera was a Brownie Starmite, and I just took pictures of everything. And I took artistic pictures of my sister. I turned the camera to the side so that she was standing in a diamond shape. I put flowers in her hair. I did, there was just a sense for me that this was a vehicle for self-expression that came to me without anyone telling me that that's what it was. It just felt that way to me. So that was kind of already built in, I just always loved taking photographs. And then by the time I got to high school and they had a photography department, and suddenly, there was a dark room and there was a teacher that could show me how to do it. I was in. I was all in. That said, when I got to Kirkland, I thought, I was really thinking I'll do that, but I also will become a psychologist. And because that's actually, my father was an academic. So I think I had that in my mind back then, that was preferable, but I couldn't for the life of me pass statistics. And I finally had to sort of give it up and say, okay. And then change my major to photography.
Huh.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always been interesting to me about photography is you and I could be standing in the same spot, see something and take a photo of it. And yours will obviously be a lot better looking than mine.
Not
but
necessarily, yeah.
But is it, do you, obviously there's technique involved and so forth, but do you fundamentally see an image in your mind's eye that as you're taking these photos that will ultimately become the finished product?
It depends. I mean, there are times when I have done photography. I mean, have you looked at my website, helenmorse.com?
Yep.
So if you saw some of the hand-colored ones, the man in the angel wings.
Yep.
I bought those wings and I had them for months. I needed a model. I needed someone a guy, because I wanted a man, that would be willing to wear them shirtless. So that I could do the photograph. And in that case, yes, I had that in my mind. I knew exactly what I wanted. And because I was doing black and white photographs then and hand coloring them, I had a general plan. I wanted him to look sort of unearthly. You can still see the straps that are holding them onto his shoulders, but there's something kind of almost holy about him. And it's funny because when I gave him a copy, and he was a librarian and just a friend, a peripheral friend. I said, I have these wings. I don't know. I can't find anybody to put them on. He said, I'll do it. And it was like, great, you're on. When he put my photograph up at his desk, he's a very shy guy. When he put my photograph up at his desk, he said all the women were looking at him differently. Which I thought was just so great. That's a successful photograph. It was really fun. But sometimes I have something in my mind. Sometimes I set out to do something interesting and I play. Sometimes I'll go out with my camera and it's kind of like a photo safari. I go out to see what I can find. So there's a little of everything. I mean, I just love taking photographs. I love looking at other people's photographs. I like looking at people's family albums. I just love photographs in some general sense.
And then how do you feel about what technology has done to the art form?
Oh God, I love it and I hate it.
I figured that would be the response.
I miss the darkroom. I can't say that I was a great technician because I wasn't a techie. I wasn't like into all the equipment or even all the different chemicals. I knew how to do what I wanted to do, what I needed to do, and I could do it well.
Hmm.
and I had mastery in the dark room, and it felt really great to me. And I had a dark room in my home for many years. And at some point, when I moved, I would take the big stainless steel sink that I'd had fabricated at a factory, took it out of where it was, moved it with me where I was going. But at some point, with the improvements in digital photography, I just couldn't rationalize it anymore. I'd been exposed to those chemicals for 25 years or so, and the fixer was starting to make me cough. I'd walk into a dark room and I'd start coughing. So I knew that, it was probably a good thing for me, but honestly, the learning curve is so darned steep that it's been frustrating, edifying, challenging, interesting, and completely hateful. I mean, it's all of it, the computer, there's a problem. I can't figure it out why. I end up calling friends. There's just, there's always something that is, there are snags along the way. When I used to walk into the dark room, that was my kingdom. I knew what I was doing and I got what I wanted. I'm still getting what I want, but it's just the process is just much more difficult. I feel like a dinosaur. I mean, I didn't grow up with computers. I'm learning. My son is just, insanely fast and good, and he knows how to do everything.
Right.
It's just the nature of the beast,
Well, I'm curious, is there any element to it where it feels more dishonest or impure in what you can do digitally that you couldn't do before, or is it not unlike changing the chemicals or changing how much light you let into a dark room to
right? No, it doesn't
photo?
feel dishonest at all. I mean, the truth is a camera is just a tool. Computer and a digital camera is just another tool. There are more things you can do with that tool, and hallelujah, that's not a bad thing.
Right.
And there are limitations in other ways, but it's just a tool. It's like anything. It's a paintbrush.
Yeah. And ultimately, as you said, you're coloring photos and doing other things to manipulate it. So it's just to get the image that you're trying to get out as an artist.
Right. Right now, I have to use Photoshop, which I hate, but I'm doing it. Yeah, and I'm still attempting at times to sort of find the new way of translating the images back into something that I can hand color. I still haven't. It's not so easy, and without a dark room now, I haven't found the perfect solution. But I'm experimenting.
Interesting.
Because I would prefer to do that with my hands.
And the show you mentioned in Barcelona, is that new work?
It is not new work, actually. And some of it is relatively new. Some of it is very old. Because I actually entered 2 competitions. They have 2 different competitions every year. They've been doing it for 17 years. It's an international competition. One is for women photographers only, and the other is for everyone all around the world. And I got accepted into both shows. So this is going to be really 2 different shows all in one building, and in Barcelona, and it's really exciting. I've never been accepted to both before, and it's exciting. Yeah,
that is exciting. And does showing at a show like that, or when you mentioned the one you won, does that help business? Does thing pick up? Do you start to see some sales from that?
No, because I'm not. This is where being represented by a big gallery in New York really comes in handy, and there are only like 6 people who are. I'm exaggerating, but it's not for someone like me. It's a lifelong passion. It isn't necessarily translating to my bank account at all, so I sold a piece last week, but it's just not. I mean, before that, it had been a couple of years. So if talk about a starving artist, if I'd had to survive on that, I'd be dead now. It's just not something you can count on. But you never know. I think all of us second tier artists always feel like, well, maybe when I'm dead. Because a lot of artists were discovered when they were died. It's like,
That's
thanks a lot.
the long running line, right? That's the way to become a
Right. So,
popular artist is to die.
and
Yeah.
so you just don't know.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. If you feel good about what you've done, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And then, whether you get discovered, further discovered for your photography, or now perhaps your writing, you did decide to put on a different hat.
That is the freaky part. Is I've sold it. Well, I'm not going to say on your podcast how many I've sold, but I've sold phenomenally well. This book is really selling.
That's great.
And it's just sort of a crazy feeling for me, because here's this one thing that I worked so hard on my whole life.
Yeah.
And forsaking other careers and other things I could have done, taking shit jobs because, that was the thing to do, and focus on what I was doing. And then I decide to write this book because I really felt it was something that I always felt that I should deserve to be written down. And we are in this pandemic, and I had sort of begun doing a little bit of writing. In fact, one of the pieces went into the Lost Orchard too, the book by one of the Kirkland people. I sent that. It was not a complete book at that time. It was vignettes, and I sent that in. But when the pandemic hit, I had nothing else to do. I wasn't going anywhere else. I wasn't getting out. And it was like, okay, now is the time. I couldn't make pictures. I don't know why. It really sapped the visual stuff out of me, this pandemic. But suddenly I had a lot to say. And I sat down and I wrote the book.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And I saw, in doing research for this conversation, I saw you wrote a piece about why you wrote the book and got into some of what you're talking about now. But in that, you also said that you never considered yourself a writer, never considered yourself a good writer, and in fact struggled with it even in college.
Yeah.
So how do you get over that hump?
Well, I guess what I said to myself is, okay, you may not be, it may not be Moby Dick, but you need to try to write this story down. And if you fail, okay, but you got to try. And so this really is, I gave myself permission to fail. But I made sure that I gave it my best. And that's what I did. I just like, okay, you're not a writer. You don't really know what you're doing. But give it your best and see what happens. I took a class in town just before the pandemic started for memoir writing, just to make sure that I was not, an adult ed class. I mean, no big deal. But just to make sure that I was crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And that teacher ended up being my editor. So that was really actually, and I didn't approach her. She approached me and said, I'd be honored if you would allow me to edit this and get you ready for publication. And, I know, being an editor's daughter, that every writer needs an editor. I mean, it's just, you need to do it. One pair of eyes is not enough. And so she was wonderful, had a great experience with her. But it was basically done, most of it during the pandemic.
It's interesting, the pandemic draining one form of your creativity, but yet fueling another one. That's fascinating.
It did. Yeah, which is kind of strange. Well, the book, of course, is a memoir. It's the story of my life. It's the big story of my life. And I had this sense that I might not survive the pandemic. My photographs were done, but this story, if I didn't take the time to write it, there was no one else that could, because everyone else had passed away, except for my one sister, and she's severely dyslexic. She wasn't going to write it. And so it really fell to me, and I just felt it was necessary. I had to do it.
That's really interesting, and I think gets at was one of the key questions I was curious at exploring with you is as an artist, I'm sure there's a level of comfort in exposing some vulnerability, exposing yourself, because you're putting your artwork out there, and inevitably there's some of yourself in that artwork.
Yes.
But it's not as personal and directly personal as the stories you tell in that book,
Right.
which are things that you don't always discuss at a cocktail party.
Spot
Um,
on. Absolutely. You
so
nailed it.
was there a struggle in that, or I guess the answer you get to this was another way to leave your story behind that your photographs don't do is really interesting to me.
Well, I'll tell you this. When I finally got the book done and I knew, okay, it's time, to publish.
Mhm.
It was as good as I could get it. And I sat with my computer, and you upload the book because everything's digital now. I uploaded it into Amazon. They do all of the printing for me.
Mhm.
And all I had to do was press publish. I had I couldn't sleep the night before.
Hmm.
It was scary as hell. I sat there looking at that publish button for some time before I hit it. I At some point I said to myself, I'm 68 now, but at the time that I did it, I was 67. And I said, Helen, if you're not able to withstand, whatever may come from this at this point in your life,
Mhm.
you're never going to be ready. And just do it. So I did.
And what was the key driver of wanting to get the story out? I mean, I've heard you talk about before, and I think you say it in the book also, is that you've always thought of, I should write a book someday. This is a story. I
Yeah.
mean, it's pretty remarkable, fascinating story. Some of the things you share in
Yeah.
the book, but why want to get it out there and not keep those things personal?
Um, Partly, what drives that for me is a little bit what Making Images drives me as well. In that I have a real need to express myself
Hmm.
and my view and how things hit me. I think that it comes from probably a really powerful sense of loneliness that I've carried with me my whole life.
Hmm.
A lot of reasons for that are in the book,
Mhm.
but just the sense of really wanting to find and reach out to the other person who's out there somewhere who will be touched by it and will
Mhm.
understand it and will get it. And for me, writing the book in some ways is very similar to what I do. The difference, though, you're correct, is that when I do a photograph, I play with being ambiguous. I mean, ambiguity is my friend.
Mhm.
When you write a book, it's your enemy. You can't be ambiguous. You can, but there's a lot more specificity to writing, and it was a challenge. I think for me, it's always been a thing to join the human race and be a part of some kind of understanding and some kind of empathy and some kind of um, it is a way for me to connect to other people,
Mhm.
whether I'm
Mhm.
doing it with my artwork or in the beginning I wrote the book really for family members because there are a lot of family members who really didn't know us because we were the rich family, and
Mhm.
so they came to visit, but they never really knew what was going on in behind closed doors in our home.
Right. Right.
And so to some extent it was a love letter to them and also to the people I did live with, to say, just because we had more than you did doesn't mean we didn't have troubles.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that we didn't suffer like you may have in other ways.
Right.
Um, and some of the ways we suffered were just like the way other people do, but it wasn't visible.
Yeah.
So, so there was that. It was also, my sister's suicide, which was really the catalyst for me to begin writing. Because once she was gone, I realized I could tell the whole story.
Hmm.
And I didn't want to hurt anyone by writing a story. And up until then, I certainly would have hurt her.
Uh-huh.
And I had no interest in doing that.
Uh-huh.
Um,
It's
so,
one of the things that stood out to me in hearing you talk and reading the book is
mhm,
just how, regardless of people's actions or what had happened,
yeah,
there seems to be a deep understand, like with you, an understanding and certainly a forgiveness
yeah,
and empathy across the board, that no matter what, someone else is dealing with something else as well,
that's
right?
right. It's true.
And I think that's a really clear-headed view. Certainly, looking back,
I think that it was a very good thing that I wrote it at the age that I'm at,
hmm,
because I have had a lifetime of time to think about it and
yeah,
make peace with it and
yeah,
understand it and really feel an empathy for everyone to
yeah,
some extent, to understand it. I mean, I think that's why I wanted to go into psychology in college, was because I
hmm,
wanted to understand all of these crazy ass people. I mean,
hmm,
there was just, it was just a rogues gallery of characters, and some of them wonderful and kind to me, some not so much. But the circumstances also were so different. Growing up in Palm Beach, right down the street from Mar-a-Lago, and seeing Edward and Wallace Simpson walking around arm in arm, holding hands. It was a very unusual place to grow up,
hmm.
and so I always had a sense that that would be something that might be interesting to people, just on all on its own. And
Sure.
then just to say, this is what my experience was in this household that looked so glamorous from the outside, and to sort of show the underbelly. I think that that's what great art does too. And I'm not to say my book is any piece of great art. It's not, but it was my best effort, and in terms of illustrating my experience,
Hmm.
and really spelling out. I hope that when people read my book, that they feel like they were there with me, that they could smell it, that they can
Yes.
see things, that they can feel a little of what I might have felt. And I don't focus on myself in the book at all. I really focus on my
Yep.
siblings and my family, because I think it would have been almost beside the point to write about me at that point. It was really what I witnessed and what I felt, but also in the context of these people, and trying to understand them and why they were the way they were, you know.
Well, and to your point about trying to help people feel like what it was like to be there in the
Mhm.
moment, that stood out to me, and I was wondering how much of that was the photographer in you coming out, of painting this very clear picture of the surroundings and what it felt like, evoking the feeling of being in a room or being in a place.
Yes.
That came through clearly, and that
Well,
was,
thank you.
you were losing your ability to take photos at the time, but I think you were putting
Yes.
it on paper for sure.
I certainly, that was conscious.
Uh-huh.
It was a conscious effort, because I wanted them to really understand. I think when they got to the end of the book, to understand the heartbreak in its totality,
Hmm.
the loss was huge, and it started early.
Hmm.
And how do you understand that unless you really feel and see and smell those flowers in the garden in the first house in the Mamaroneck? How do you understand, um, how naive I was back then, and
Yeah.
I had a nanny that loved me, but I was afraid that she only loved me because she was being paid to love me.
Hmm.
And then to discover that she actually did love me. I mean,
Hmm.
all of these
Hmm.
things are, I mean, I spent most of my life really feeling like no one would understand my story, to some extent, because would relate or even be interested on some level, because I grew up a little rich girl, and there's no other way to put it.
Hmm.
Um, and I know there are a lot of people in the world that hate that little girl. And I've felt that my whole life. uh, probably particularly because I don't come off that way. I don't embrace it. I never loved that part of me.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never, uh, people who have met me in my life have felt very free to say horrible things about people who had money or grew up with money, because I don't look like one of them, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't act
Mm-hmm.
like one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew very intimately that hatred and that sense of um, having been cheated out of something, and why them and not me.
Right.
And I felt that way, why me and not them.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a real sense of disconnect, and I think that's where that sense of loneliness I mentioned earlier came from,
Yeah.
because I felt like I didn't belong. I didn't belong in Palm Beach because I wasn't a waspy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed heiress from, you know, some royal family somewhere.
Yeah.
And yet I was also half Jewish, half Italian. I was, to the kids in West Palm, I was a rich kid. They didn't want to hang out with me either because I I didn't fit in there. I was too polite. I was too well spoken. Went off to camp and learned these really bawdy songs, and I was horrified. I mean, I'd never been exposed to these things. So there was always this weird disconnect for me. Anywhere I went, I didn't belong. And so for me to write the book was to describe really a heartache that is very hard to express otherwise. And that part of the book, which is a little more subtle part of the book, is definitely there. I use, I use my sister Debbie's trajectory and everything that she went through, because that was spectacularly horrible. I'm a survivor. I have the survivor guilt for sure. And I had the guilt of being the favored daughter and all of these things. It was a complicated story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of things I wanted to say, and I managed somehow to squeak it all in there. And at this point, it's almost an out of body experience for me, because I never expected to write a book. Never.
You mentioned it's selling better than you expected.
Oh, yeah.
How happy are you with the just overall response outside of the sales? People reading
I
it
am
and telling you about
thrilled.
it.
People are writing me and saying, thank you. I lost a sibling to suicide. Thank you. I grew up with a governess.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for proving that it doesn't matter what you have in life, that the problems are the same. Thank you for being so honest. Thank you for being, you're inspirational because you survived it, and you still forgave them. And I mean, it's just been this wonderful. My editor looked me in the eye. It was funny because I said to her, I was concerned about the last one of the last chapters where I go and clean the blood off the floor at my sister's house after she killed herself. And I thought maybe I had just gone a little bit beyond the pale there. And I said to her, are you sure this isn't reader abuse? And she laughed at me. And she said, Helen, you watch. This book is going to be a life-changing experience for you. And she was right. It has been. In a million ways.
Yeah.
In a million ways, more ways than I can count. And I think the biggest thing for me is that people who didn't have my background are, I've gotten a couple of nasty notes, but every writer does. But you can't please everyone. But the letters that I've gotten saying, thank you. I didn't grow up the way you did, but I'm so grateful that you wrote this, that you proved. I tell my daughter all the time, it doesn't matter what you have, but it really doesn't. And life's problems are life's problems.
Right.
So
And no matter how good you think someone has it, there everyone is dealing
everyone
with their
has
own.
problems.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
there's stuff. Some people are more confessional than others, but
Right.
there's always something there,
Right.
and that's been really a very healing, lovely thing. And not that I was broken before it. I really haven't been. I really worked very hard on understanding who I am and what I went through, and how lucky I was too. I mean, it isn't all bad. Some of it I was extremely lucky. So I'm aware of all of these things, but I wasn't sure how it'd be received because I
Mm.
know how people feel about little rich girls, and so it was a little scary for me.
Well,
Only my
good for
best
you for
friend.
going through with it. Good for you for actually doing it. A lot of people who probably also, I think, hear that part of the story and hopefully are motivated to sort of share their truth as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I actually have spoken to some people who are like, well, I'd really like to write something. I say, look, if I can do it, you can do it. I'm not a writer. I wrote
Uh-huh.
a book.
Uh-huh.
You can do this too. And it's true. You
Are
just
you
have
gonna
to want it
are you
enough.
gonna write another one?
I'm thinking about it. I'm getting
Okay.
a lot of people are bugging me. Okay, what's next? What are you going to write next? It's like, oh my God, I just wrote, for me, I wrote War and Peace. And now you want me to write something else?
Right.
I am thinking about it. I am staying, in touch with the people that I've met who are writing on a regular basis. And I am thinking about it. Yeah.
Good. Good. How much you mentioned your editor father? Obviously, he's a key
Yes.
figure throughout the book, but how much did the editor father play in the process of you writing? Did you have him in your head?
I did. I mean, I did in the sense that I know that if he were here, he'd be furious at me. I mean, he'd be out of his mind with the fury that I exposed the family,
Uh-huh.
that I talked about all of these things, that possibly there were things that he didn't realize that I felt this way
Right.
or that way about
Sure. Yeah.
any given thing. But I also know that when he calmed down, he might be a little proud of me too.
Right. Right.
Even if he didn't want to be.
Right. Right.
So they're both things, and fortunately, my whole family's been so supportive. Everybody, and of course, my sister Carolyn is living, and I had to approach her. Actually, approached a number of people that are in the book, mentioned in the book. Wallace, the boy who had the chain around the refrigerator, was so abused. I contacted him. I said, "Look, this is what I'm going to tell.
Hmm.
I think it's important for my book to add this story because it's so egregious.
Hmm.
But it is your story, and I don't have a right to it unless I have your permission."
Hmm.
And he was very gracious. He said, "Write it, absolutely write it." Carolyn, I read everything I wrote about her to her,
Hmm.
and we discussed it. And she said, "Helen, you're telling the truth. Tell it." So I've just been so lucky to have, the people who I needed permission from
Yeah.
to give me that permission, because otherwise I said to Wallace, and that's not his real name, by the way. I said to Wallace, if you object, I will remove that part from the book.
Mhm.
I just will. So, and I would have done the same for Carolyn's sake, but I'm very happy that I was able to write the book as I wanted to write it, with full permission from the people who are a little bit exposed.
Hmm. And doing some of the research, you said that's ultimately what made you happy to self-publish this and not have to deal with worrying about
Yes,
a publisher trying to
yes,
edit you down to
yes,
take away parts of the story.
yes,
You
yes.
wanted it
I mean,
raw.
I wanted my book on my bookshelf,
Hmm.
and I wanted my book, the book I intended,
Hmm.
on my friends' bookshelves and my
Hmm.
family's book. I wanted that story, not changed so that it would sell more, not, altered. That's my title. That's my photograph on the cover. That's, that's my book. And I'm, it would have been nice if it had been easier, but nowadays it's very difficult. It could take you 2 years to find a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And I was ready. And it was so easy. I mean, Amazon, you can say what you will about Amazon. I'm not in love with the company, but they make it so easy for someone like me to write like hell, pour their heart out, and then hit that button, publish.
And get it and find an audience, right? And get an audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you got that one done. Now the second one, you get the big advance and the publisher and the whole bit.
There you go. Yeah. You never know. You know what? I mean, it's all been, it was funny because when I sold the first few hundred, I thought, oh my God, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And I was imagining like a party at my house and all of these people. That's just a ton of people. And I couldn't imagine selling this many back then. I couldn't have imagined it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, meanwhile, it's not a moneymaker. I mean, in the sense that I have to advertise to make people aware that the book is there. So I'm not making but the satisfaction is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And the idea that there are people that I don't know who are reading this story and getting something out of it. Mm-hmm. It's, whatever it is that they get out of it.
I appreciate you. I appreciate you telling the story, and congratulations on how it's done. Hopefully, we sell a few more books through this conversation. The Hamilton community
you never know.
Rally around one of its own. Yeah. Before I let you go, as you think back to that young woman locking herself in the dark room at Kirkland, and over the course of your career, is there anything you wish you had known back then?
Yeah, I think I wish I'd taken a few writing courses. Beyond that, yes, I think that I would have told that girl that there are people that would understand and can relate to you, and it may not feel that way, but you're wrong about that. People will understand, will forgive you for having grown up that way. And we'll empathize with you.
All right, that's Helen Morse, Kirkland class of 1976. If you want to see Helen's artwork, go to helenmorse.com. We'll have a link in the show notes. And of course, you can buy her book, The Difficult Girl, on Amazon, which we'll also have linked in the show notes. And don't forget to register for her author talk being put on by the school this Tuesday, September 27th, which we will, you guessed it, have linked in the show notes. My thanks to Helen for joining this week. Best of luck in continuing to sell the book and to your show in Barcelona. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on the show. And, once again, Doc is going to play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.